When it comes to critiquing video games as a medium, as a vehicle for art, for narrative, for pressing F to pay respects, for rhythm action minigames to force children to admit to murder, for lewd magazine-based superpowers, and for so much more, an inevitable tension that we run into is the one between three broad camps within the development, production, and publishing spaces: the artists, the STEM people, and the capitalists. That's not to say that there's like a hard line between all three. Most people have at least a little bit of overlap on the individual level, and they do all interact with one another. Nobody exists in a bubble. But just about every critique you make of the medium requires you to acknowledge that this tension, this dynamic exists on some level. Artists are trying to make art, STEM people are trying to make software, and capitalists are trying to make money, and these incentives often put them at odds. The best way to make money often isn't to make the best art or the most refined piece of software. The best way to make sound software often isn't going to result in the most artistically impactful product or the most profitable one. And the best way to make art often isn't going to be to approach it from the perspective of, what's the most technologically impressive and or profitable thing we could do with this? It's also not to say that video games are unique for having any sort of version of this tension. Every medium does. It's just that a crucial difference with the video games is the nature of the relationship specifically between art and technology in terms of how uniquely pivotal the STEM people are just for the existence of the medium in the modern day. Compare video games to television, movies, books, music, or stage plays, and you'll definitely see where STEM people play a role in them, but they have much less, I guess you could say, artistic leverage within the process. Achieving the artist's vision and making money tend to dominate the incentives compared to trying to be the most technically proficient or making a glorified tech demo or whatever. Now, this channel has discussed the tension that the capitalists bring to the table many, many times before, so for this one they're going to take a bit of a back seat. We are specifically going to be focusing more on the tension as it exists between the artists and the STEM people, as much as we can anyways. And the reason we're going to do that is because this video is about realism at its core as an art style, or at least what people think realism is. And that's a topic where, when it comes to video games, there's some complicated back and forth in terms of who ends up on which side of the argument, why, and to what extent. This video will not only try to explore why realistic graphics, and by extension, kind of realism as an artistic style within this medium, never look quite right, but are fundamentally incompatible with the medium of video games. And to do that, we'll be looking at it from both sides of this dominant tension between art and STEM, and then, seeing where the discussion takes us. Maybe we'll do a little bit more. Maybe we'll branch out and be a bit more dynamic ourselves. The best place to start then is probably to discuss what realism actually is, and what it means for something to be realistic. Part 1. What is realism? I think part of what makes this concept uniquely difficult for us to grasp in the modern day is that up until the last few generations of human history, it was actually very, very rare for any sort of visual art to be truly realistic. Paintings, sculptures, drawings, and whatever other styles of art we as a species developed were inherently pretty limited in their capacity to capture pure, unaltered reality for a bunch of reasons, a lot of which just came down to medium and materials. The medium part is obvious. We didn't have stuff like photography or film until very recently, both of which are much more amenable to realism by default than any other past medium. When it comes to materials, it's also fairly obvious. We don't appreciate how recently in history it became possible for the average person to buy a box of colored pencils or any shade of paint they desire, or any type of paper or canvas or clay they could realistically need, or whatever else. For a long time, people made art because it is an inherently human thing to do, to want to create art, and that meant working around some pretty severe limitations. Certain colors were famously much more limited than others, with purple being so notoriously expensive for so much of human history for so many cultures and societies that we still maintain its connotation with royalty. Beyond that though, the global supply chain we live in today makes it easy to forget that at one point in time, it was possible for an artist to just end up with an unwinnable spawn point where the materials they would need to produce their art, like animals with fine enough hairs for brushes or the right kinds of clay to make sculptures, literally just did not exist and could not be acquired in their lifetime. And it's even easier to forget that that was really recent in human history. Obviously, it's still not like capitalism gives everyone an equal spawn point today either. That's what socialist realism in art was for. But a poor kind of modern developed country still does have an infinitely better chance of running into a wider selection of color options among dollar store Crayola knockoff paints than 99% of humanity has ever had. The reason I bring this up is because I think there's a tendency to treat realism and realistic art as the default, or the natural, or the neutral style from which all other art must be born, or spawned, or inspired. None of which are remotely the case. I mean, for one, what a lot of people think of when they think of realistic graphics isn't literally realistic. If we're being truly honest here, almost nobody actually wants the human characters in video games to look literally real in the vein of academic art. When we're talking about realistic graphics, we're talking about graphics kind of in the style of realism, or at least in what people think is realism. And that's why this sort of thing is important to grasp. Realism is not purely literal. Rather, it tries to avoid exaggeration or artificiality. A lot of artistic styles, including those meant to depict real events and people, do lean into these things. Sometimes this is because the distortion of reality is part of the point of the art. Think caricature. But oftentimes there is a grander or more sinister goal sometimes behind it. For example, there are plenty of realistic-looking paintings that are, in fact, not realism. It was not uncommon for monarchs to request that their portraits flatter them more than reality did, both out of vanity and kind of as part of their duty as national symbols. Nobody wants to have the weak-looking nerd king with the birth defect. They want the Chad king who fucks. That's why everyone gets drawn taller than they actually were with bigger cod pieces, unless it was politically advantageous to draw them shorter. This was done in a style that was not meant to be cartoonish or caricature. In fact, it was meant to be realistic. It was meant to imitate realism and reality for political ends or for a bigger goal. But it still wasn't reality. It still wasn't literal. Realism as a style is a response to that sort of art that depicted humanity in the real world through a filtered lens that cleaned up the subject matter. It was meant to be unvarnished, to show the ugliness of ugly things so that the beauty of beautiful things stood in its correct contrast. It was a statement of honesty and intent, of depicting people fairly, really, and truthfully, and all people as people. There's a reason why socialist realism was the art style of the Soviet Union. Realism can be an equalizing force that doesn't pretty up the powerful while dressing down the working class, at least in theory. In practice, depicting the rich and powerful realistically still has the capacity to glamorize and elevate them depending on perspective or approach. The clothes that the wealthy wear are going to typically be nicer than those that the poor wear, and it still makes them look nicer if you depict it realistically. A more honest depiction of it might portray them with some sort of indication of how they got their wealth and power that makes them a little bit less beautiful, or at least puts the beauty in its context. This is a big part of why it's important to understand that realism is not the default or the neutral state. It is, just like any other art style, motivated by the desire to say something about its subject. To show you what I mean, I'm going to bring up an artist that I adore, and it's a bit of a tangent, but bear with me. This is Nefast Greentail. They are unbelievably talented and have gone viral a ton of times because of their insane ability to replicate just a huge amount of different art styles. This piece, using their OC truck, shows how the art style of a piece can change not only how it literally looks, but what kind of vibe a person might have when depicted differently. Some of these trucks look like nicer people than others, do they not? Others look smarter or funnier or whatever else. The implications that you draw in your mind from these characters are going to change, or from this character in different styles will change depending on the style. Imagine in your mind what a realistic truck would look like, and what parts of these fictional depictions of this character are being preserved by that art style versus what's being left behind. There's another artist who's been doing some fun photo bashes with the Danganronpa cast, and it is really interesting to me because, personally, I actually react pretty negatively to them most of the time. That's not to say I think they're bad. They aren't. They are very well made, I think, and I do kind of like to see them, but I don't like them. I don't enjoy them, if that makes sense. After all, realism is about the idea that you're peeling away the facade to reveal what's truly under there. And personally, my approach to art is that I don't need it to be free of facade a lot of the time. I'm of the opinion that the facade is part of the art. It's part of how we perceive and approach and interpret and explain the world to others. And make no mistake, realism is also a facade. It's the I'm a real ass bitch in a fake ass world of art styles. And that's part of why I personally don't really like it. It's like how liberals think they're the only ones without a political ideology. Just common sense, We don't have any radical liberals. We just have liberals. We just have people who, think what normal people think. I don't have a lot of respect for anyone who couches their understanding of the world in the desperate desire to be one of the normal ones, or not like those other fake bitches, when none of us are normal, and all of us are at least a little bit fake. That's not to say that realism doesn't have its own place or purpose. In particular, realism does play a role in laying some ugliness of the world bare in a way that other artistic styles are more amenable to glossing over. And that glossing over has often been done in service of people in power, or, in service of reinforcing certain narratives. However, for our purposes, realism is also implicitly treated as a demonstration of skill, that only the very best of the best painters and sculptors and drawers can truly capture reality free of varnish. This is, to put it bluntly, a mentality that has only become increasingly common with the broader artistic illiteracy of the general public as funding for arts education has diminished over the years. Realism definitely does require skill, don't get me wrong, but the problem with so many people who don't understand art is that they treat realism as though that's the inherent end goal of any visual medium, for the art to get as close as possible to being indistinguishable from reality. And that's the part where it's an issue of artistic illiteracy. And this is also where you start to see the problems emerge in other media. Part of the reason why you're getting all these live-action remakes of Disney movies or other animated films is because, at least in part, the capitalists are exploiting that artistic illiteracy. They know they can make money off of you going to see the live-action Lilo and Stitch or whatever because they assume the general public will hold a live-action remake in at least equal, if not higher esteem than the animated original by dint of being live-action, even if its existence is superfluous and redundant at best and, worse by any objective metric at worst. There's a reason why this dynamic doesn't usually go in the opposite direction. Animation is treated as fundamentally incapable of being better by a shocking amount of people because it's not realistic, it's not real, it's not live action. People kind of look at it like it's the mock-up or the pitch deck for the real deal, which leads the capitalists to try and remake it in live action so they can treat the live action version as if it's the true, most, advanced version and sell it as such. It's also worth acknowledging that this often isn't realism, especially not in the literal sense. It's a facsimile of it, an invocation of realism's concept of reality, but very much so not meeting the definition. Mixed media of live action and animation is inherently not realism, right? Who Framed Roger Rabbit is not realism just because there's live action mixed in, you know what I mean? Mixed media of live action and animation is inherently not realism. But beyond that, many photos are photoshopped and movies are edited constantly with the goal of painting over aspects of reality that are not conducive to the piece of art. And even when it's unedited, it's still going through camera lenses and software and so much more that will inevitably distort color, shape, and more. And to some extent, that's fine, and not even inherently at odds with the core intent of realism. It's just part of creativity and creation. The problem here is that the average person, again, suffering from that artistic illiteracy that's so widespread, has the same level of understanding of realism that the average straight guy does about what a no makeup look actually looks like. And so while a lot of this application of the term realism is technically incorrect, I am so sorry, arts majors. Unfortunately for you, I'm going to keep being, focused on speaking to those who do not have your degree. It's still necessary for understanding how we get to the problems that we're getting to. For video games, though, it's a little bit different. And that's what we need to get into next. Part 2. She's not like other media. Video games struggle to a unique degree with this artistic illiteracy issue because, unlike a lot of other media, it doesn't really have a clear, realistic counterpart. Animation has live-action film, and painting has photography. They are not the same by any stretch, and they serve totally different purposes, but when people who don't really get art very well want to complain about a painting not looking realistic enough, they can point to a photograph as a counterpoint. Video games, by contrast, do not have a realism baseline or alternative to be compared to. And that's a challenge. What's more, it's a modern medium whose distance from realism is one that wasn't inherently an artistic decision. Objectively speaking, we did not have the hardware to do anything remotely approaching realism for consumer gaming until maybe a decade ago, depending on how you define it. And this is actually somewhat unique. Not in the sense that hardware limits the capacity for realism or anything. We talked about other media before and how materials can get in the way, like painting and stuff like that, but, just compare this to television. The quality of a television broadcast for a long time wasn't very high. However, it was still capable of broadcasting a human being, even if it was a lower quality broadcast of a human. Hardware limiting the capacity to approach realism is an inevitability, but in a lot of cases, it's, because some aspect of the medium itself needed technological improvements to get to a point where it was possible to capture reality via that medium and then present it as such. Television and movies not only needed cameras to get better, but needed TVs and projectors and movie screens and whatever else to get better too. The reason it's unique with video games is that, fundamentally speaking, you're not starting with a human being acting as a human being. In theory, the closest you can get is an FMV, like a full-motion video game. But even then, your actions and decisions as the player will change what those characters will do or how that setting is interacted with in a way that I would argue removes the realism of even that genre. The reason I bring this up is that it means that we don't even have that flawed baseline of, why don't paintings look like photographs? Because video games don't have their equivalent of photographs as a consequence of their interactivity. Video games definitely can get close to something like a live-action realistic movie in certain respects, or certain aspects, I guess, but every instance of player autonomy destroys that. For example, is it realistic for the Master Chief to get bored and start shooting his fellow UNSC soldiers? Is it realistic for the Dragonborn to rampage through Whiterun for the same reason? If you remove the capacity for the player to make the characters behave unrealistically, does that not violate some principle of what it means for it to be a video game in some way? As well, outside of those FMVs, and even with them to some degree, video games inherently can't use straight-up human inputs in the way film and television can. You can get close with motion capture and all that, but that's all processing realism through the kind of technological filter that realism is supposed to try to reject. The kinds of filters that, distort reality. You have to animate things in a way that breaks realism. Grass, fire, water, cloth, movement, hair, everything will have to be animated because that's how this medium works, even with its most realistic models and bodies. And what's more, most consumer hardware is not capable of handling that sort of thing. Just like what's happening with the new Halo shit, where they've made it perfectly model the impact of tire treads on the sand or whatever, but the game can't fucking run it, and people's consoles can't run it. So it's just kind of a waste of time for everyone. Hell, as someone who has its own 3D model with full body tracking actively in the works as we speak, I can't exactly argue that what I would be doing with that could possibly fall under realism, can I? Just because there's a human input into what the model is doing? There is that inherent digital barrier that exists between the inputs I can give my models and the outputs they produce, including this 2D one, that, renders reality non-real, and there's not really a way around it. Instead, when video games aim for realistic graphics, they're aiming for pure simulacra. It can't be the real thing, nor can it be an imperfect representation of the real thing. It has to be a fake thing made to look real, which feels like splitting hairs, but I promise it is a distinction that matters, and it's tricky when it doesn't have any other medium that it can pull directly from for it. Video games are one of the only forms of visual media that does not have the capacity to do pure realism, which is one of the main reasons why it doesn't look right. Or at least the attempts to do so don't look right, I should say. This is something that the art side of the tension does, in fact, generally understand, whereas I would argue the STEM side of it seems to struggle pretty hard. In fact, a major reason for the tension in the first place is that this is a medium that not only developed without a realistic parallel, but without the capacity for anything remotely approaching realism in the first place. And that's what I want to explore next. Part 3. Computer make these guys super gay and super realistic. So, a fun thing about most media is that technology is a barrier to communicating realism, just not to the extent that it is for video games as mentioned before. However, what's different here is that most visual media had some core capacity for at least capturing realistic visuals pretty much from the jump. Yes, cave drawings that we have at least encountered weren't realistic. Maybe there's one in a cave somewhere that we just haven't found yet, featuring a true genius at work. But in theory, those tools and technology could have potentially been used to do a photorealistic drawing. Video games, when they were invented, literally could not do these sorts of things, and the tools to do them within the medium could not exist due to pretty hard hardware limitations. Something we don't really acknowledge often enough is how insane the tech progress has been on this front within an extremely short amount of time. And that's not normally how media develops. This is, in my opinion, the reason why this tension exists uniquely for this medium compared to all the others. No other medium progressed this quickly along its tech tree, nor was its development so dependent on integration of the tech people into the artistic process. The people on the creative side of things in terms of stuff like the artwork or the writing or the animation were, pretty dependent on the people on the tech side of things to not only build the tools for them to be able to make it happen, but also the tools necessary for it to be compatible with the hardware and software of whatever era they were in. This is especially important because the limitations on the artistic side of it were direct obstacles to being able to produce games that, were even understandable, much less enjoyable. Early video games relied on the audience having enough imagination to turn a handful of pixels into a person when the graphics and consoles and discs and everything else were unable to even hold the kind of information necessary to do that for themselves. And the kinds of stories you could tell or the kinds of characters you could tell them about were pretty hard-locked behind this tech progress. You needed the STEM people to be involved in the process because they had to try and find ways to close the gap between the intent and execution, and then the artists had to work with what they had. Sort of an easy way to contextualize this is to look at Pokemon. Early Pokemon games were working with such tight restrictions on memory that basically everything was being min-maxed to squeeze every last bite out of the cartridges it was shipped on, and that inherently meant a lot of compromise. Character designs for both people and Pokemon had to be designs that would be readable in black and white on a 160 by 144 display, and also had to fit on the 373 kilobytes of space they were working with, and also had to be able to run on a device with 8 kilobytes of RAM or kilobits of RAM? Every new generation of Pokemon was accompanied by technological changes that allowed the artists to explore more of their ideas, and create characters and Pokemon and moves and effects and maps that literally could not have existed in the previous generation. That development required the work of the STEM people, both in terms of the ones working on the games themselves, but also the ones working on the consoles and the cartridges. And it's also not just like STEM people existed to make room for the artists. Their work is necessary in terms of actually convincing the computer to do what it, should be doing or what you want it to do. The artist cannot just look at their computer and say, computer, make these guys super gay and super realistic. Because the computer doesn't know what the fuck that means. And that's proven by how generative AI doesn't seem to understand how to fucking do anything. Like, please stop using it. And especially please stop using it to try and do like realistic versions of anime characters. I am begging you. The STEM people exist not only as, computer nerds, but as translators, as communicators, to turn the artistic intention into computer outputs, which sometimes means having to do some pretty creative coding because the computer does not have an innate sense of what it should mean for Thunderbolt to sometimes paralyze the opponent. The STEM people, particularly in the early days of the medium, also had to be very creative with their work by necessity because the hardware was so limited that they didn't have any other option. It was their work that allowed so many iconic pieces of music and art and dialogue to come to life in the first place in a miraculous blend of technology and art. And this was especially important back when a new console generation meant shit was about to evolve severely. It was up to the STEM people to figure out how to coax a miracle out of the next set of systems and work with the artists to determine what was possible and how best to do it. And I'm making this point because I don't want people to think that this video is just ragging on the STEM side of things, especially given how many people fill both roles to some degree or another within the medium. Their role is a lot more integral to the existence of an individual video game than in most other visual media, especially because even in other non-realistic media like animation, there's still so much more room for artists to kind of take the wheel and be like, fuck it, it works, and bend the tech to its breaking point, kind of regardless of what the STEM people are involved in. Video games, owing to their interactivity and the uniqueness of having to try and communicate with a fucking computer, need the STEM people to be able to do their witchcraft to allow everything that the artists are creating to actually happen, for the stories to be told, for the music to be played, and for the visuals to actually look like what they're supposed to look like. So many games only exist because of the tech side of things that was able to pull off those miracles working in harmony with very limited hardware and software to do some crazy shit, and their involvement in that aspect does need to be respected. That being said, at one point in time, it was a lot easier for someone to be both the STEM person and the artist for a game, because the medium had such hard caps on how much complexity it could handle on either front that it was possible to do both at the level necessary for a major production to work. In modern gaming, the demands on both sides have increased as the capacity within the medium has increased, which tends to lead these people into divergent pipelines that put them into tension. The tension that we're talking about largely comes as a result of that third group, though, the capitalists. I'm sorry I lied and said that this wasn't going to be about them at all, as well as the audience, and how the former interpreted the latter's enthusiasm for the increasing quality of graphics as time went on. Part 4. He doesn't realize he's begging for boiling water on the stove. So, an aspect of this that we haven't really touched on much so far is the gamers themselves. #GamersTM or whatever. With each passing console generation, gamers got hyped the fuck up for how much better the graphics looked, especially because it was such a massively noticeable leap for a long time. Like every few years there'd be new consoles and suddenly there'd be so much more expression and reactivity and dialogue and color and music, and it's like, goddamn, we love this shit. More polygons, sir, more voice acting, more physics, more reactive worlds and interactive environments. The thing is, this creates a bit of an awkward loop. The audience says, we want games that look better, TM. And for our purposes, the problem there is in who gets to decide on what better means. In the early days, this tension didn't really matter much, because better never really had any risk of approaching actual realism. Like, there wasn't enough capacity for the hardware and the software for it to really allow for enough divergence on that front. As there wasn't a risk of anyone actually viewing realistic graphics as the end goal of a given project. As a result, the gamers TM would say we want games that look better TM. So the executives at these companies, which, as time goes on, are becoming bigger and bigger, and so start having more CEOs and executives who fell into the more explicitly capitalist category rather than just being the tech and or arts guy that was best at leading the group of other tech and or arts people, tell their companies, your next game needs to look better TM. And so the tech and arts people would try and make a game just look closer to what the artists were imagining in their heads. Repeat the loop, not really a huge problem there. Where it becomes awkward is the point at which the technology did start approaching a point where it had the capacity for realism, or at least something resembling it. Because now you have the risk of clashing ideas of better graphics. The audience is still saying the same thing. We want better graphics. The capitalists are still saying the same thing to the artists and the STEM people. Make games have better graphics. But now the artists and the STEM people are potentially at odds about what it means to be moving in the direction of those better graphics. Artists tend to recognize realism and realistic graphics as artistic choices. Not necessarily worse than others, but, as choices that have specific purposes, that are trying to communicate specific things. And what's more, they recognize that an attempt at realism that falls short risks looking a lot more like the Uncanny Valley. On the flip side, a lot of STEM people, especially given the degree to which the arts have been defunded and a lot of neoliberal education systems don't teach the arts properly, and especially not to anyone in STEM, run into that issue of artistic illiteracy we discussed before. The idea that the goal of art, visually at least, should be to get as close as possible to looking real TM. That a painting is better if it looks more lifelike than stylized because of a perception that the goal of art is to mirror reality. And that not only is that better in some abstract notion of what better could even mean, but also that it takes more skill to do so. It takes the most skill to do realism. Now, there's a reason why this sort of thing doesn't tend to happen in like regular animation. Like people aren't aiming for realistic animation in K-pop Demon Hunters or whatever, and they don't want it as an audience because it'd look fucking weird. I mean, people have kind of been trying to do it a little bit in terms of getting generative AI to create realistic versions of the K-pop Demon Hunters characters, but they look like shit, and also, who wants that? Like, this stylism is part of the art. And even though every artistic medium experiences this loop in some capacity, video games are unique because the advancement of the medium was so often contextualized and defined in those STEM terms. And that's because of that loop we talked about. After all, it's not really enough to tell the gamers TM, we promise our games look better TM, right? Like, that's just too vague. That doesn't mean anything. Instead, the medium focused on the STEM side of things for context for its claims. Tangible numbers that it could use to prove its point. Double the bits, double the color, double the memory, things that had real quantifiable data and numbers to demonstrate that the games were better TM. The problem there is that there has been a conflation between two things that are subtly but importantly different. Those numbers, stuff like bits, don't prove that games look better. They prove they have the capacity to handle more detail. However, a game doesn't have to max out on everything to look good or to, be a good game. Undertale is a really good example of that sort of thing. And the number of polygons on a 3D model actually means very little if they're not being well utilized. These metrics were all useful for explaining why games from one generation could look so much better, or at least so much different compared to the previous one, but that's not the full story. Those numbers don't contextualize the importance of art styles and artistic direction or any of that stuff because you kind of can't do that with objective, data-driven numbers. And the problem with that framing is that as the hardware develops and the capacity increases dramatically, the ability to actually take a swing at realism starts to feel like it's more and more within reach. Combine that with the general public's artistic illiteracy, and you end up with an audience who's used to contextualizing an artistic medium in STEM terms and an understanding of good visual art to mean art that looks as realistic as possible. Talking to capitalists who understand this and also don't tend to value art for the sake of art very much and just want to make the most money. The tension between STEM and art really does emerge here too, because the STEM side is also a side that tends to have those same artistic values as the general public. Again, we do not teach enough art shit to STEM majors. We need to do that more. Please. But also, it's facing the pressure from their bosses to make games that are the most video game. And what is the most video game? Well, as we've defined things, the most video game is the game that utilizes everything the most, utilizes all those numbers and all that space the most, and all that capacity the most. And realism seems like a way to do that. And that ends up meaning even more realistic characters and sounds and environments. Does that mean that it suits the artistic side of things? Absolutely not. And many games have suffered for trying to get a little too realistic with their graphics, especially when they don't really have the capacity or the willingness to go all in for it. Just look at how something like Conquer Live and Reloaded looks compared to Conquer's Bad Fur Day. The original cartoony art style for the game was part of its charm, and the remake actively loses that sort of thing by trying to look more real in terms of stuff like fur, lighting, or whatever else, while also not grappling with the objective lack of realism involved in anything about that fucking game. Like, why are you trying to give the cartoon squirrel realistic fur? Who asked for that? Nobody, except for, I guess, whoever wanted it to make money. And this is something you actually see more and more over time as studios return to old games to remake or remaster them and, whoops, accidentally butcher the original iconic art in the process of trying to exploit all the hardware power available to them now that wasn't available for the originals. Just look at Halo Combat Evolved in its remaster. Or actually, go watch Noodle's video about how this game fucking sucks for these exact reasons. Good art is not inherently the most realistic art, especially because no one can really agree on what realistic art should be or what, the boundaries of it are. But even if we set that aside, it turns out that realistic lighting, physics, textures, and all that other shit isn't inherently the same thing as looking good. or interesting. This isn't to say that more realistic graphics, and by that I mean more realistic proportions, physics, lighting, texture, all that sort of stuff, will inherently look bad and should never be used either. Realism, or at least as close as this medium can get anyways, can be used well and to prove a point. It's also not that this is exclusively a problem with realistic graphics. Stylized graphics that are fixated on trying to do the most rather than trying to do the best run into this too. Just look at Pokemon, which doesn't give itself enough time to actually do any of that sort of shit. The problem with realistic graphics specifically is that they don't just fail at looking good, and it's not even just that they fail at looking realistic necessarily. It's also that they fail at feeling realistic. And that is a pretty important and pretty unique problem when it comes to this being an interactive medium. Part 5. Touch the fashion, change your life. Most visual media is not meant to be actively interacted with as part of the process of experiencing it. Whether it is makeup, fashion, painting, film, or whatever else. It is a very passive experience in a lot of ways. And that's not a bad thing, to be abundantly clear, especially when it comes to expressing an artistic style. This is actually really helpful when the artist has complete control over the experience that the audience is going to be having. The fact that other media isn't interactive isn't a negative, or proof that video games are better, or that the ceiling for video games is higher than any other medium. It's just a difference. Video games aren't like that because a fundamental part of the medium is the interactivity and the autonomy inherent to it, which does pose a problem for everyone involved. See, the more stylized a game is, the more the inherent jankiness of player control gets kind of a pass. Games like Overwatch and TF2 benefit tremendously from very stylized art because not only can they do more goofy shit, but they also don't have to try and make things make sense from the perspective of realism. What would be more realistic in this situation? And especially, they don't have to grapple with the more horrifying consequences of a lot of what they're doing. A lot of video games invoke violence as a mechanic in a way that would simply not be fun if it were realistic. Stuff like burning people to death or shooting them in the face with a machine gun plays very differently if it's a cartoon character making a goofy scream and ragdolling to the floor versus a realistic looking human being with a body reacting realistically to those things. A stylized video game can do some stuff that on paper would be fucking awful to experience, would be horrifying, would dramatically change the tone of whatever's happening. But then soften it with the art direction in terms of visuals, sound design, music, and whatever else in order to create a more, casual, lighthearted, or even just generally more fun experience. Part of why I brought up TF2 specifically is that even in universe, this concept is being invoked by Pyrovision, where the Pyro's atrocities are largely enabled by the fact that he perceives his actions as being something much more cheery than it actually is for the other characters. That's sort of the joke of that whole thing. And I know this feels a lot like we're just jumping around, but I promise it is all connected. The less tied to reality your game's art style is, the more leeway you have in terms of cutting corners in the name of the experience or the performance. And the more room you can take to influence the impact of the experience on the player in terms of mitigating or exaggerating certain aspects of it. Making the game less realistic means that stuff like violence isn't as traumatizing. It doesn't play on our empathy in the same kind of way. Whereas sometimes your artistic intent is trauma, and some version of realism can help you, in which case you get stuff like Mortal Kombat trying to realistically depict the brutal decapitation and murder of all these people. And you get the PTSD that the people who've worked on the game without proper counseling experience after having to actually learn what it would mean for this shit to be done to a human body. Non-realistic graphics cue the player to not assume realistic intent with the rest of the game, which, is important for setting expectations. A game like Overwatch can have characters and mechanics and weapons and maps and abilities that are, not the most realistic, we could say charitably, without having to justify it to the audience because the art style is communicating to you that you aren't supposed to expect realism from it in the same way that you would for something like an older Call of Duty game. Newer Call of Duty games, I don't know what's going on with those. God bless. I hope they're doing okay or not. Probably not, actually. But I do mean this sincerely. The more you gravitate towards realism as an art style, the more it comes into tension with the inherent unrealism of the medium's interactivity, especially because realism and reality often just aren't super fun. Most shooters aren't actually fun if you get shot once and die permanently or survive with a disability. Being able to absorb bullets and respawn and revive dead teammates with defibrillators, all that stuff breaks realism even if the art style for that game looks kind of realistic in the process. This is why I talked about how looking realistic and doing realism are also two distinct things at the top of the video. The point about how portraits of monarchs were done in a realistic style but without being reflective of genuine reality. So much of realistic graphics in air quotes in video games is that latter style of realistic, which is a problem because the interactivity of the game theoretically could make it closer to reality, even though it inevitably drags it even further away, regardless of how realistic the art style is. A video game cannot control where you're looking without forcing you to hand over control, which means that the thing that makes it a video game is being lost, or at least diminished, in service of giving control back to the creators to enforce their art style and their artistic vision, which is often necessary to make things happen realistically for cutscenes or whatever. Otherwise, characters wouldn't be talking realistically to each other, or your character might not respond realistically to what they're saying. I mean, think about how this sort of thing happens in gameplay moments. Is it realistic for a highly trained army guy to need to be told 6 times to get in the fucking chopper at the end of the mission? Touching the art changes your experience of the art. And if the art is being created with the intent that it can be touched, then it also has to decide how it's going to let you do that. And is it capable of letting you do something beyond what it wants you to? The more you can touch it, the more difficult it is to maintain coherency and the meaning of the art, regardless of how each individual chooses to touch it. And in that process, it becomes more and more possible that a person's experience will enter the realm of the fundamentally unrealistic. Most games basically just bottleneck you back into the story and into the sort of, illusion of reality that it's trying to capture every now and then. You can roam freely in non-realistic behavior mode while the game waits for you to activate the flag for realism to start happening to you for a bit. Again, not in all games, to be very, very clear, but like in stuff like Call of Duty or whatever, where the pseudo-realism of the situation is meant to be part of the pitch. You kill all the enemies in an area, then you walk to the next area where you lose some degree of autonomy in order to force you into the dialogue and the action necessary for whatever semblance of a story there is to progress. But the less realistic a game looks and acts, the easier it's going to be for the ludonarrative dissonance inherent to this medium to be tolerated by the audience. After all, the 100-line Last Defense Academy is not trying to be realistic on basically any front, which means that even if a choice that you're being presented with is objectively absurd and you have behaved entirely unrealistically during combat or free roaming or whatever else to get to that point, it's not going to take you out of it. If 100-line was styled like a Call of Duty game, on the other hand, bit different story there, isn't it? A comparison worth making here is between stage shows and movies. The stage is inherently a medium where realism is kind of impossible, especially if you have, changing sets. You can't be in Paris or anything that's going to realistically resemble Paris. The audience is expected to understand that the set is not literal but figurative. It is communicating to you that it is Paris and you're supposed to accept that and move on. Not be mad that the cobblestones don't look right. That's why you can get away with painted cardboard for the backdrop. It only has to be clear enough for the audience to understand what it represents and they're supposed to fill in the blanks. Compare that with film, live action films, to be clear, where the backdrop has to look like what it's actually supposed to be. It has to look realistic, or at least much closer to it than what's expected of most stage shows. Same goes for audience interactivity. The audience doesn't really actively engage with either medium, but it's not uncommon for a stage show to engage directly with the audience in the way a movie never can. This is a huge advantage for stage shows because the inherent lack of pure realism also allows for extra gags and bits and jokes that don't really make sense for a movie. Stuff like a wall falling on a character on stage is extra funny when the audience can see that it's just a piece of cardboard painted to look like a wall, whereas in film, this usually just looks kind of shitty. Cats is an excellent example to look at here, because the stage show basically never actually attempts to do realism in any capacity. It's very openly just on some bullshit with its props and costumes and everything else, and that's kind of part of the appeal of it. But for the 2019 film production of Cats, well, we all know of the horrors, or maybe we've forgotten some of the horrors because it's, right before COVID and then everyone kind of blacked out everything from a 5-year period there, but hopefully we can all at least remember the horrors. And for gamers specifically, Sonic is another really good example of this. The original live-action Sonic design was horrifying because it turns out that Sonic in real life would kind of be an abomination. A realistic interpretation of a blue super-fast hedgehog. I don't, especially if it has any sort of humanoid proportions, no, let's not do that. Bad. Bad. Not a good thing to have exist. It ended up looking better because they abandoned realism in any sort of capacity and just leaned into his more cartoonish video game design. And again, the original Sonic live action was not realistic or realism in the literal sense, but it was playing off that idea that the more realistic thing is the better artistic thing. And then they abandoned it because at some point you just fuck it up too bad and have to give up on it. Part of this stuff is a consequence of studios not wanting to invest the money necessary to get the realism they want from their fake shit. Again, we've all seen the thing about how Pirates of the Caribbean had CGI that absolutely lapped anything in Cats 2019, but part of it is also that realism requires a lot of work and cohesion in the project to seem real. And the reason I'm bringing it up is that video games allowing you to muck around in the art with your grubby little unwashed fingers makes realism really, really, really hard. And I think it's an aspect of this that the capitalists don't care enough about and the STEM people don't really seem to grasp the artistic implications of until it's way too late. Non-realistic art styles allow for so much more wiggle room, the same way that Cats on stage allows for so much more wiggle room than Cats on film. So many of the people involved in the process of creating video games don't really seem to recognize that there are things that you can no longer get away with if you're aiming for realism when you're adding a, bit of the old touch the art medium. And the strategies for doing realism in other media don't work the same in aforementioned touch the art medium. The more realistic Master Chief looks, the more the contradiction between his appearance and his capacity to massacre his own team or blow himself up with a grenade for fun sharpens. The more stylized he looks, the more it's okay for his weapons to look a little bit goofier if it means it's more clear to the player what they actually are, supposed to do or what makes them different from each other. Or the more it ends up being a little bit okay if he actually does fuck up a few times. But if you're interpreting looking better TM as looking more realistic, again, however you define realism and reality and realistic, then you also feel like that goofiness of interactivity is at odds with your end goal. So you either just accept that and have this, dissonance in the existence of it in the art style and end up creating some uncanny valley bullshit, or you try to reduce and contain that interactivity, which, sort of as I've mentioned throughout this video, means what I would consider to be losing a lot of what makes games not only great, but what they are. And this is one of the big answers to the question posed by the title here. The reason why realistic graphics never look quite right often boils down to the fact that at some point, it's not really just about how it looks. How it feels and how it plays will inevitably skew the way you perceive its realistic art style or its attempts at realism. And I don't think there's been a game made yet that manages to engage with realism as an art style without also, in the process, inevitably giving the player the tools to mangle that realism in the same breath. And again, invoking reality in your art can be artistically meaningful, and subverting expectations with it can be really, really entertaining, even if it's not really the intent of the piece of media, as seen in the famous "Did you mod this? No" video.
Like her here. What the fuck?
No,
What?
weird.
Yeah, she does look a lot different all of a sudden.
She's
looks
not
like,
Sheva.
She looks like Tomb Raider.
That's weird.
Did you put a fucking mod in this?
No.
But part of why it also doesn't work is because it's often not being done to be artistically meaningful. It's being done without regard for the actual artistic implications in favor of just being able to say, our game has so much goddamn graphics in it, look how realistic it looks. And that is a result of those pressures from the STEM, capitalist, and audience factions of this dynamic in this discussion. And that's the next point I want to touch on. Part 6. Pas de Russe. No Russian, the Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 mission, is a really good example of this to me. I wasn't actually initially going to explain this, but given that the game is nearly 20 years old at this point, there's actually a pretty good chance that a lot of people watching this video have genuinely never played it and have no memory of the controversy that surrounded it. For those of us who did, time to start integrating those hip stretches. Stealing that joke from Blake Jennings because I am not an original person. Creativity is not my strong suit. I don't know how I didn't end up being a STEM person, but regardless, here we are. There's a lot of context to that mission, but the short version of it is that, as part of an American soldier's undercover mission with a Russian terrorist group, he is going to participate in a terrorist attack on a Russian airport. His group is armed with heavy machine guns that rip through the civilian population of the airport, causing massive casualties amidst the horrifying screams of pain and fear and anguish amongst your victims. The mission's name comes from the terrorist leader's iconic instructions at the beginning of the mission. No Russian, meaning, only speak English, no Russian language. Your character doesn't realize that the reason for this instruction is that Makarov knows that you are an American spy, and his plan is to murder you at the end of the mission and leave your body behind as a way of indicating that this was an American attack on Russians, to justify the latter declaring war on the former, an intent emphasized by the decision to use American / kind of NATO-oriented weapons for the attack. It was, at the time, infamous for its horrifying nature. In the midst of this run-and-gun hoorah military propaganda is a pretty cold, cruel, cutthroat representation of the reality of violence and militarism and terrorism for innocent people. It's not even like this was just accidental or people's imaginations assuming it was more violent than typical for a Call of Duty mission. There are aspects of this mission, like how wounded victims will try to drag themselves away, leaving a trail of blood behind them, that don't really show up in the rest of the game. The fragility of the human body, the anguish of indiscriminate violence, the callousness of terror, the geopolitics of the era, and the just brutality of it all. Like, a lot of it is wrapped up in this mission in a way that people did not respond positively to. Like, it was unpleasant. And especially for people who weren't super familiar with video games or the Call of Duty mission, like parents, who walked in on their kid playing this one, it was a bit concerning. And controversial hot take here, that's not a bad thing. In fact, I'd go so far as to say it's a good thing. Art that makes you feel uncomfortable and confronts some deeper unpleasantness about the real world using realism as a tool in that process can be very powerful and very artistic. And I would argue that beyond the actual art style, this is a genuine attempt to engage in not just, realistic art in the abstract, but realism as a broader big picture concept. The problem is that Call of Duty didn't really follow through on the promise of it or engage with the ramifications of realism on the broader piece of art. No Russian is definitely supposed to be shocking and a bit of a rough experience to go through for sure, but its artistic intent is corrupted by the terrible storytelling surrounding it and the fact that a lot of the same realistic graphics without the holistic realism of certain aspects of No Russian are going to be used throughout the rest of the entire game, and it kind of fucks with it. Or, alternatively, and probably more accurately, it accidentally implied a different intent in No Russian than it meant to. By doing realism on an interactive terrorist attack, Modern Warfare 2 accidentally introduced meaning that it did not intend to introduce. And that's a real problem because now your story is trying to say something that you didn't, tell it to say. And it is specifically the player's role in this, like the interactivity of that experience, that makes the impact of, even just attempting realism exponentially more dramatic than if something similar had happened in a live action movie. The interactivity of the medium changes the experience on every front. But a big part of the issue here is that so much of a game's direction comes from the non-artistic aspect of the development process. The capitalists responding to the audience and the STEM people responding to the capitalists. The artists are, in a lot of cases, fairly hamstrung by what the capitalists want and what the STEM people are able and willing to do. And if both of them are aiming for realism, then the stories that the artists are trying to tell are going to get warped, especially when that realism is applied so inconsistently. Also must needs to be remarked, a lot of people who end up in creative positions are not overall educated on the arts. Like that includes people who both just don't have a formal artistic education and also people who do have one, but which is very limited. Lots of people who are skilled in visual arts are not well known for their capacity for writing a good story, if that makes sense. No Russian as a COD mission is unique in so many ways. None of your enemies, innocent people, respawn. They mourn death. They are actively suffering psychologically from the attack as it is ongoing. And they flee the violence in the messy, chaotic, panicked way that you can see in any sort of news footage of the outbreak of a mass shooting where people start to hear the sound of gunshots and then, freeze for a second, then they turn and they try to run away and start clambering over each other and running into barriers. The interactivity of the massacre and the relative realism of it is heightened by the relatively realistic graphics of this art style. After all, would it have been so controversial or impactful if it had been done in the style of Overwatch? Probably not. Still could have been impactful to some degree, but not nearly as impactful. Just look at the Toronto PvE mission where Omnics, who we as the audience are meant to recognize as fully sentient beings on par with ourselves, are being brutally attacked and hijacked with these torture devices by a terrorist. It doesn't exactly ring the same, does it? The problem is that the production incentives of Call of Duty combined with their actual purpose as military propaganda and the limitations placed on their ability to tell a story as a consequence of that is that this game can't actually tell the kind of story that No Russian belongs in. Realism is being done because it will sell more to an artistically illiterate audience of gun and ball gamers, and No Russian was being done because it was necessary to kick off the next part of the story. But then you combine them both, and you have a controversy and a story that undermines arguably the only culturally relevant narrative beat from the entire franchise that generates its relevance from something other than a comically stupid QTE. And again, realism can be artistically meaningful. I would argue that some of the earlier Call of Duty games actually kind of do a little bit more with that. Not to the extent of No Russian, but at least try to do something like that. And it's not even like you have to be going into a piece of media expecting exactly the level of impact that you received in order for it to mean something. Nobody started playing a Persona game with the intent of being irreversibly changed by the soundtrack of it. And yet that doesn't stop it from happening. The problem is that you're feeding foie gras and caviar to someone who went out for some fine dining at Eastside Mario's. You're throwing some pretty intense acquired tastes at them without proper context or capacity to prepare their taste buds. And to be clear, this is also something that can happen in reverse. People who expect a certain level of realism or turn their nose up at certain art styles like anime can be exposed to a genuinely good game in that style because their palate isn't trained for it. I am reminded of my Nana who, when I was a child, nearly got incapacitated by an IKEA hot dog because she just did not eat that kind of processed food anymore. It's been nearly 20 years since that day, and she still remembers it. I, meanwhile, ate too, and I was fine. We bought a futon that day. I don't know why that matters, I'm sorry. Anyway, I know it feels like we're losing track of the original topic about why realistic graphics are never quite right, but I promise I'm not. This is part of the discussion. Realistic graphics are never quite right, not only because genuinely realistic graphics are basically impossible to actually achieve in video games, but also because even when games try to invoke that simulacra of realism via realistic-ish graphics, or closest the hardware can get at least, they often misuse it so viciously that it makes it all feel wrong and draw attention to the lack of realism in the art style, or the shortcomings of it, or the shortcuts that are made. And Modern Warfare 2 shows both ways that this commonly happens. Either you're using realistic graphics as part of an art style during objectively unrealistic gameplay like 99% of Modern Warfare 2's gameplay, or you use realistic graphics combined with a more big picture approach to realism as an art style during something that attempts to invoke that realism through its interactivity like No Russian, and then accidentally do something far more serious and real than you were prepared to follow through on. And then, by failing to actually respect the outcome, you diminish it with that aforementioned 99% and just make it feel worse than it otherwise would have. And that is also something worth addressing. Part 7. Sometimes things that are real are worse. Reality often just sucks. Video games as a medium have more capacity for escapism than most media purely because of their interactivity, allowing you to genuinely engage with that escapist fantasy one-on-one. And so the further away from reality something is, the better that escapism can be. Invoking realism with actual intent can work, but as mentioned in the last section, it's often done without that intent, and then it just kind of sucks the way that reality does. Arguably even worse, because it's supposed to be an escape. More realistic encumbrance systems actually kind of suck in an RPG. More realistic lighting sucks in a lot of games because they, benefit from a little bit of unrealistic lighting. Sue us, I guess. I don't know why I'm getting defensive about that. More realistic character designs are going to often be more boring in almost every game. Which begs the question of, why does it still happen even if it often makes the experience worse? And again, it brings us back to that fundamental artistic illiteracy. Lots of people see the experience suck and think, the problem is that it must not have been realistic enough graphics. Like, I didn't like the graphics, so it must have been a failure of realism or of trying hard enough. And so the demand that gets made by the dumbest and loudest amongst us is the next game in this series needs to be more realistic. When in reality, what they're actually asking for is better art design or better art direction in some form. It's like how a lot of the time the critiques of voice acting, and I, will fully admit that I've made this mistake before myself, are really meant to be critiques of voice direction, but because people don't understand the process, it tends to fall on the voice actor themselves, even though the voice director is the one who's responsible for the mistakes being made a lot of the time. Anyways, this is kind of a stupid approach to everything, especially because it often ends up being objectively contradictory as a consequence of people approaching critique from the perspective of, I like good art, I think art is better if it's more realistic, therefore if I like it, it's realistic, and if I don't, then it's not. Because then you get the Grumses of the world, whose critiques of character design are basically just, I like big titty, skinny waist, beautiful women in video games. I don't like any female character design that doesn't exist to get me hard. Therefore, Stellar Blade is a better game than Horizon Zero Dawn. Or whatever bullshit emerges from that guy's mouth next. It's the, I like women wearing a subtle makeup look, but I'm being fooled by it into thinking that it means she's wearing no makeup, so I'm going to say that I like it more when women don't wear makeup at all, and then act like every makeupless woman I see must be like diseased critique. This isn't to say that makeupless women or the more realistic female character designs are worse. They aren't. But they do run at odds with the escapism from reality that the person taking this kind of approach wants to be able to live inside of without having to confront the actual reality of the situation. They want to live in a world where the women all look like they're wearing foundation and a red lip when they wake up in the morning because that is a more pleasing one for them. And the thing is, we do all have our own kinds of versions of this. We all have aspects of reality that we just don't like and don't like having to acknowledge. I personally don't like the limitations on clothing options for men, either in real life or in video games in terms of stuff like color or cut or how, short the shorts can be. And when I play a video game, I do not want to be limited to what would be realistic for a man to wear IRL in a given context. Teenage me was putting my Saints Row 4 protagonist in a short skirt and thigh highs while he fucked around, and I wish that was realistic. Wanted to believe on some level that it could be. However, again, reality often just sucks compared to our ideal escapist fantasy. Shocking, breaking news, I know. Video games are, as a medium, in a pretty unwinnable position here because their audience isn't, frankly, very good at actually communicating what they want, and so they demand realism even though what they actually want is escapism that just feels like it kind of be real enough to escape into relative to their real life in some nebulous way. But that's kind of a nuanced take that doesn't really tend to make it through the anti-nuance filter that is the internet and the world. Then capitalists take that and say, okay, let's make the game realistic. You need to make the game realistic. That's what we're paying you for. And then the STEM people try to do realism without much of a framework for what realism actually is or should be for, or how to use it as an art style. And then artists are trying to make it all come together, and it just creates a mess that makes nobody happy because very few video games are willing and able to simultaneously engage with realism as an art style and explore reality with it, warts and all. Part of why realistic graphics don't work is this broader tension of almost everyone involved not understanding that aiming for realism is directly at odds with aiming for escapism. That realism as an art style explicitly exists for the purposes of exposing the bluntness, harshness, and unkindness of reality. This is why I talked about why realism was originally developed as an art style at the beginning of this video. These video games are not trying to use realism as a vehicle for speaking truth to power or something, or invoking the ugly honesty of an uncomfortable subject, or leveling the playing field, or whatever else. It's being done because STEM brain and the profit motive and artistic illiteracy combine among a critical mass of people to the point that the art style that exists for portraying and preserving the unflinching, unvarnished experience of reality is just being skinned for the aesthetic and draped over some bullshit because it's the best way to turn a game into a glorified tech demo that can justify an $80 price tag. Plus, $20 DLC every couple months. The tension that exists between the artists and the STEM people here is, frankly, easiest to see when it comes to stuff like those Mario and Unreal videos that exist out there. Objectively speaking, many of them are super technically impressive on a graphical level, provided they're not using AI. Those ones look like shit on every level, and often are aiming for something a lot closer to realism than anything Mario is going to just ever try to do. But also, they don't look like Mario. And if the goal is to make a Mario game, then realism would objectively fail him. He fundamentally exists outside of realism. Realism is best suited for the hypothetical version of Modern Warfare 2 that tries to tell a story that no Russian actually belongs in. But the problem is that that version of Modern Warfare 2 wouldn't appeal to the balling gun gamer because people don't want to actually think about the horrors of war in their games. They don't want to have to think that hard about it. Otherwise, something like Spec Ops The Line would be a lot more popular than Call of Duty ever was. And even then, people critique Spec Ops for being unrealistic because you're, forced to use white phosphorus to progress instead of refusing, as if that would have been what was more realistic for the character you're meant to portray. Because, again, the interactivity of the medium and our autonomy within it is frequently at odds with the concept of realism in these stories and the deployment of it as an artistic style, as an artistic choice. You or I would take a moral stance and, of course, not use the white phosphorus if it was in our control. If we had Tourette's, our ticks would be things like trans rights and Black Lives Matter. And we would also hopefully not participate in No Russian if we got to choose. We would hope that we would probably choose to shoot Makarov in the back of the fucking head at the beginning of the mission. And that kind of brings me to my last point here. Part 8. You're not him, little bro. We've kind of already touched on it here in terms of interactivity, but we do really need to acknowledge how much we struggle with the dissonance between what would be realistic for us as the players versus the characters that we are inhabiting. This is really hard to do even remotely effectively, and is one of the reasons I have a ton of respect for the 100 line. It does a lot of legwork to communicate Takumi's characterization to you over the course of that 40-hour prologue. Kind of joking, but not really. Go play 100 line or at least watch my video about it, so that when it's finally time for you to make some fucking choices, you can understand why Takumi wouldn't make the choices the way he does, or that he would, present the options, that he would consider which options are valid the way he does, or why those decisions affect him the way that they do, and what it actually means for you to be standing in his shoes and guiding his decisions here while they are still his decisions to make. Most games, by contrast, struggle to do this, especially because a lot of them aren't really trying to, and that's fine. A lot of games want the player character to be an avatar for the player themselves, to be a blank canvas for you to mold into whatever you would do in their shoes. Master Chief does have a character to him, but the game isn't ever really trying to convince you to behave in a particular way by making you understand why it's a decision he'd make. Compare this with a game like Persona, where the player still has control, but the types of decisions are guided by the personality of the game's protagonist. You can only ever say what he is willing to say, or talk to people he is willing to talk to on a given day, or hang out with people in a given way, depending on what he's willing to do and what he wants and what that other person wants to do, whatever. Whatever else goes into that. The personality of that character is usually pretty baseline neutral, relatively speaking, in order to be agreeable with whatever options the player is likely going to want to explore regardless, but it's still definitely there. And this is where realism tends to really fall short. I know the subject of this video is graphics and that this might sound unrelated, but it genuinely is not. If the art style isn't realistic, then there's also more of an implicit understanding that the character is not you. That you are not meant to be straight up represented in the game, that this is not a human being in the literal sense in a literal human world, but instead you are piloting a fictional character. The more it tries to be realistic and make you feel like you are really there in a world that is yours, that you recognize that is fundamentally associated with and based in your reality, the more jarring and unpleasant the contradictions feel when they are inevitably exposed especially because of the interactivity of it all. Compare the fact that Joker can't date Akechi in Persona 5 Royale in spite of their obvious chemistry, and the fact that Akechi's basically constantly communicating that he wants to hate fuck Joker until one or both of them dies after a certain point, to that aforementioned Spec Ops White Phosphorus moment. Both are instances of the player being explicitly told that whatever their intent or desire is, it is not going to be reflected in the intents and desires of the character they are inhabiting. With Joker, it doesn't super feel like this undermines the story for either character, because the fact that Joker does not want to explore it is kind of part of his story, and you can choose to interpret it however you want. For example, I choose to interpret that as Joker also being into Akechi, but he's even more into the idea of rage baiting Akechi, so he just continues to string him along until he can get Akechi to actually explicitly admit he's down bad, which, of course, Akechi is never going to do. Have you fucking met the man? However, Joker is surrounded by graphics that are simultaneously communicating that none of this is real. An ever-present underlying reminder that at the end of the day, this is fictional and that you are not Joker. You aren't him. Realism is not the goal of this game, and it is not burdened by the implicit and explicit assumptions that realism or even just, the attempt at realistic graphics will entail. Martin Walker, by contrast, is surrounded by the closest approximations of realism that the hardware of the time could handle. It is made to feel holistically like realism, even when there are aspects that aren't literally realistic in the vein of something like academic art. And it is made to feel like you are being forced to make a realistic decision. And that's by design. Spec Ops: The Line isn't trying to do escapism, it is trying to get the character or the player to confront the ugliness of real warfare in direct contrast to the glossy whitewashing of it that so many military games contribute to. It is a game that is in effect trying to intentionally do what No Russian kind of accidentally did, or what No Russian fundamentally failed to do if it was attempting to do it. And so it forces you to continue contributing to the atrocities and, communicating that it's putting the power into your hands. The problem is, obviously, that the power is limited because it's not really your hands. It's Martin Walker's. Or their Martin Walker's. Grammar's hard. Martin Walker does want to do this, or does want to frame the decision in these terms. Or at least his addled mental state has him believing he wants to. And you aren't playing this game as you. You are playing as Martin Walker and need to be making the choices that are realistic for him and his setting and his circumstances. Like, the devs have caught some flack for that game for saying that the white phosphorus thing is a choice because even though the game can't progress without using it, the player has the option to put down the controller. And, the critique from players is that that's not really a choice. But of course it is. It's just that that's the level of choice you can make. The choice to use white phosphorus or not within the context of the game is not yours. It's Walker's. It's just that this art style and the connotation it carries tends to make it feel wrong to people within this medium. You are playing the story of Martin Walker and are expecting the story to be one that you, not Martin Walker, get autonomy within. And you're expecting that you will get to exercise that autonomy within the story itself. The game isn't doing a cheeky fourth wall break like some, Metal Gear Solid Phantom or Psycho, what's his name? Keep this in the edit. Psycho Mantis, that's who I'm thinking of. Spec Ops: The Line is not trying to do some Psycho Mantis Metal Gear Solid shit where it's deliberately a fourth wall break, turn off the console or reset it or remove a memory thing, whatever. It's not that. It's just presenting you with actions and decisions and letting you do what you are willing to live with if you are Martin Walker. The realism of it all makes it feel like you're supposed to get to behave in the way that you find realistic, and you just aren't. And I think in and of itself, that isn't a failure of the art to do its art. It's just that it feels at odds with what we want realism to be within an escapist medium. We want it to feel like the version of reality where we're embodying these protagonists who are strong or powerful or talented or, alpha chads who fuck and just never get traumatized by warfare. That's what we want. We want to exist in that embodiment in a world where everything is just the way we want it, or that we have the capacity to make it what we want it. We want it to be a sandbox or something that we can mold into our version of reality. And we want it to feel like it is realistic within that process because that makes the escapism all the more powerful. And when the realism is at odds with the art, whether visually, auditorily, or narratively, it makes it all feel like something's wrong. Like Spec Ops: The Line is a game building off of shit like Heart of Darkness. And in the same vein, you're not the protagonist. You are not the lead of Heart of Darkness. You just follow the story. However, you never had to do any of the shit in Heart of Darkness. You never had to pull the metaphorical trigger. And at no point are you under any illusions that there is any way for you to stop anything in it from happening. At most, you can, like with Spec Ops The Line, choose to put the book down and not experience it. Stylized art direction in games, by contrast, can help us gloss over those contradictions. And I'd like to point out that that's not inherently a good thing for art either. Realism for Spec Ops The Line is part of the intent, and you'd lose that if Walker looked and sounded like the fucking soldier from TF2. The overarching problem with realism in video games and why realistic graphics feel so wrong isn't really actually about the tension between arts and STEM. I'm so sorry I lied. If it's any consolation, it wasn't my intent at the beginning. I just argued myself out of that position to some degree as we went along. I mean, it helps to explain some of how we got here for sure, and why we have the problems that we have as well, but it's not the actual answer to this statement that's kind of a question, but not really, of why realistic graphics never feel quite right. To my mind, the actual answer is twofold. On one hand, we have the issue of interactivity being at odds with the attempt at realism, because the interactivity creates unrealism in a way that developers and people working on games in general have yet to figure out how to reconcile with realistic graphics or even just more realistic scenarios on the big picture holistic level. On the other, we have the issue of broader artistic illiteracy owing to the defunding of the humanities and deprioritizing of it in education, especially for people in STEM, putting people in a position where they aren't really being equipped to understand what these stories might be trying to communicate with realism, or how to emotionally process it, or how to develop the taste level for what exactly they're trying to do, or the importance of actually emotionally processing it as part of the experience of the art, and how to communicate and understand what visual art styles not only are in the abstract, but what about them, including both realistic and stylized art, is or is not working for that member of the audience in a given piece of media so they can verbalize and contextualize their critiques more concisely and clearly and correctly, frankly. And I don't really know how to fix that. Thankfully, I didn't say that I can fix it. I only said that I try to explore why realistic graphics never seem quite right. Odds are probably pretty good that I failed to some degree in that endeavor. I am, in fact, just an anime boy on the internet. There are probably arguments that you would have made differently, or points that you would have presented in a different order, or aspects of my framing that you disagreed with. However, part of the advantage of a non-interactive medium like a YouTube video is that, at the end of the day, I am telling the story here, and I am making the argument exactly the way I choose to. I don't have to try to communicate my points while allowing you to interject with a, "But what about X?" argument that might change what argument is appropriate for me to make next, or derail my train of thought. I do that to myself more than enough as it is. I also, thank fucking God, benefit from not making this argument with my real human face and body in my real office space with my real furniture in the background. I don't think you would listen to me as much if I did. In fact, this whole VTuber premise is kind of built on the assumption that I can say and do a lot more specifically because it is an inherently unrealistic framing that helps to lower people's guards. And from my real world experience, it has been a lot easier to get people to eagerly listen to and enjoy such long discussions of media from a hot anime man than from my real self. Almost like realism isn't the best vehicle for communication even of relatively serious topics, whether in fiction or non-fiction. Funny how that works, isn't it? And that's where this one's going to end. Thank you so much for watching, and if you'd like to see more, including an upcoming video about how nobody knows what the word twink means anymore, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss it. This was the Members' Choice video from May, and while I still have to catch up with the aforementioned twink video chosen in June and the Shoot and Order one chosen in July, plus whatever's going to be chosen in August, I've mentioned it a couple times, but September is going to be the last MC poll for a while, owing to being overwhelmed with work and school and everything. If you want to have a say in these last couple polls, you can join the membership for $5 a month on YouTube or Patreon at the links down below. Lastly, thank you very much to all my channel members, both now and from when this video was selected in May. At the $25 Elite membership tier, thank you to Adele, Robot Juice, Bingo Banga, and Blue Rider. At the $10 Premium membership tier, thank you to Andrew Tanar, Cavi Corbin, Corey Anders, NJD, Mooney, Trevor, and Mint Pancake. At the $5 channel membership tier, thank you to Cage the Orc, Fish Toast, Alex Stone, Destiny, Cadence, Marsh Alice, Crimson Cyclo, Cat Lover 192, MV, The Only Enigma, Mariah, Meep Cube, Noisy Pitta, Harv, Eski Sebi, Deku_, Aman Dadley, Lala, Teo Tamara, Alinea, Caffeine Jelly, Aiden S, 1000 Dumplings, Nilost, Lily Hero, Mitzicore, Bubble Boy, Shy Shy, Shine, Ox, Prolaya, Gallium Conch, Felix, Bulk, Garfield Kermit, Biggest Tigus, Corpicocta, Lily, Propaganda, AJ Moment, Patrick Wallace, Tebo, and Barodity. Whether you're a channel member, a subscriber, or just decided to click on this video out of curiosity, thank you very much for watching, and I hope I'll see you around again soon.